Hello and welcome to this Foster Care Institute online training webinar, Understanding and Responding to Neglect Upon Children. I am your host, Dr. John DeGarmo, founder and director of the Foster Care Institute. I am an author of several foster care books, a speaker at conferences and events, a trainer for child welfare programs, an expert witness for legal firms. Most importantly, I am a parent to over 60 children who have come through my home from foster care, a parent of 6 children of my own as well. As you can imagine, as a parent to over 60 plus children from the foster care system, I have seen up close and personally what neglect looks like and how it impacts children and those who love them. I have had many children placed in my home and who have become members of my family who have experienced neglect. Our goal during this Foster Care Institute training webinar is to increase understanding of what neglect is for children in foster care and to examine solutions. Our two key objectives are to increase awareness of what neglect is and gain understanding of how to develop and implement strategies designed to help children who have experienced neglect. As caseworkers, as foster parents, as advocates, we often hear the term neglect. Indeed, children are placed in foster care for abuse, for abandonment, for neglect. But what is neglect? When we hear that term, when we hear that word, what does it mean? Well, according to the online dictionary, neglect is this, defined as the following. Child neglect is a form of abuse, an egregious behavior of caregivers, for example, the parents, that results in a deprivation of child of their basic needs, including the failure to provide adequate supervision, health care, clothing, or housing, as well as other physical, emotional, social, educational, and safety needs. All societies have established that there are necessary behaviors a caregiver must provide in order for a child to develop physically, socially, and emotionally. Again, this definition of neglect is found in the online dictionary. But let's dig in further. Let's examine what neglect is at a deeper level. According to the Federal Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act, or the CAPTA, they define neglect as the following. They define neglect legally as any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caregiver that presents an imminent risk of serious harm to the child. Again, this definition comes to us from the Federal Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act. Now, to be sure, state laws often define neglect as a failure of a parent or caregiver. A caregiver could be a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, an older sibling, a friend of the family, somebody who's caring for the child, providing care for the child. So again, it defines neglect as a failure of that parent or the person caring or taking care of the child who provides food, much needed food. Now, hopefully this type of food is food that is nutritional for the child. It's a failure to prevent shelter, a house or a home, clothing, medical care, or supervision, supervising the child. Now, this neglect, this failure to provide this shelter, the food, the clothing, the medical care, the supervision, the failure to provide it to a degree that the child is now in harm in some way. The child's health is threatened. Their safety is threatened. Their well being is threatened. You may know there are various forms of neglect. There is educational neglect, there is the emotional neglect, there is the neglect of inadequate supervision. Of course, there is medical neglect, and there is physical neglect. Let's examine each of these in more detail. In regards to a child's educational neglect, it is the failure to educate a child or provide for special education needs. To be sure, children in foster care who are placed in a foster care home, statistically, on average, are 18 months behind academically. They struggle with reading and math skills. These children often have had educational neglect. Before they are placed in a foster care home, their educational needs often were neglected. Now, to go on, this educational neglect of a child includes a failure to enroll a child in school. Indeed, as a foster parent myself, I have had several children placed in my home who were never enrolled in school. I recall numerous times, if you will, having to take a day off work and enroll a child in school and not having any type of paperwork, if you will, because a child was not enrolled in any school whatsoever in the surrounding area. The child simply had not enrolled in school. Perhaps as a foster parent, you have experienced the same thing. Perhaps as a caregiver or a caseworker, you have experienced or seen similar examples. Educational neglect also is the allowing a child to repeatedly skip school. Now, perhaps a child is enrolled in school, but the child has significant amount of absences. Emotional neglect. In regards to a child placed in foster care or a child in general, emotional neglect is the failure to meet a child's emotional needs or to provide them some type of psychosocial support. Emotional neglect is the exposure of a child to domestic violence or substance misuse and permitting child to partake in drugs and alcohol. Let's go back to that domestic violence. Perhaps you have seen the studies here at the Foster Care Institute that point to the fact that 5 million children in the United States each year, roughly, witness or are exposed to domestic violence in their home. Indeed, this is a form of emotional neglect. Perhaps you've seen those stories or read those stories or maybe had a child placed in your home who's experienced the following. A parent allows a child to take drugs or alcohol while in the home. Again, this is a form of emotional neglect. In addition, emotional neglect also includes not providing affection or emotional support to a child. I have seen in my own home children placed in my own home who have never heard the words, I love you, I love you. No adult has shown love or even voiced those words to that child. There are those instances where the child's never been hugged or never had any type of affection shown towards them. Again, this is an example of emotional neglect. Inadequate supervision is the failure to keep a child safe from harm or danger. This inadequate supervision includes placing a child who cannot care for himself in a place alone, such as a home or a residence. The child is alone in the home for great periods of time. Inadequate supervision also go on to protect is not protecting a child from safety dangers or the hazards or threats. It is leaving a child with caregivers who are also unable or inadequate to care for him. For example, an older sibling is caring for a younger sibling, and the older sibling is unable to do so or does so in an inadequate fashion. Medical neglect. The medical neglect of a child is the failure to provide necessary medical or mental health treatment. The child simply is not receiving the medical treatment the child needs or the mental health treatment, the professional counseling, the professional therapy sessions. Medical neglect also includes denying a child recommended medical treatment or delaying the treatment that is recommended to the child. And finally, we have physical neglect. The physical neglect of a child is the failure to provide necessary food and nutrition. Now, my wife is a doctor of nutrition. Indeed, we've had many children placed in our home who have had this type of neglect. They've not been provided any type of nutritional or healthy foods. They have not been exposed to a healthy diet. Indeed, if you are a foster parent, you have most likely experienced the same thing as you care for children in your home. Children placed in your home who have not been exposed or provided a healthy nutritional diet. In addition, physical neglect also is a failure to provide clothing or shelter or hygiene, or it's the inappropriate or lack of supervision. Finally, physical neglect is also abandonment. I recall a time as a foster parent when a 17-year-old was placed in our home. The 17-year-old was placed in our home because he had been abandoned by his mother. The 13-year-old who came to our home, whose mother abandoned him on the side of the highway. The 1-year-old who came to our home was placed in our home because the baby had been abandoned in a home. These are examples of physical neglect. Now, we've seen the various forms of neglect, but what does it look like? What are the signs of neglect? How can you tell if a child has been neglected or is experiencing neglect? What does it look like? To begin with, a child who may be experiencing neglect may experience the following. Their appearance is disheveled. Their appearance is unkept, dirty, unclean. Their clothing is too small for them. Their hair is uncombed to an extreme fashion. They're simply unclean. Another example of neglect may be extreme body odor. Another sign of neglect may be eating a great deal of food at each setting, or they may save food for later on. Indeed, we cover this part about food in a webinar here at the Foster Care Institute entitled Eating Disorders. Indeed, this is a form of neglect. This type of disorder, I would encourage you to watch that webinar. Perhaps you have had a child in your home who saves or hoards food. Children who may have experienced neglect may show signs of aggression. They may show signs of anxiety or apathy. They may be depressed or show signs of depression. They may show signs of developmental delays. Indeed, we spoke earlier about how children in foster care often struggle with academics, reading, and math skills. Signs of neglect in a child may be that he is failing to thrive, or he may have low self-esteem. If a child is often late to school or has many absences from school, these may be signs of neglect. For that child who is enrolled in school and its parent simply isn't involved in any fashion in school, this too can be an example of neglect. That child who has difficulty concentrating or focusing in the classroom, this might be a sign of neglect. These are not to say that these are certainly positively signs of neglect. These are simply stating that these could be signs of neglect. That child who's left alone or with inadequate supervision, again, this might be a sign of neglect. The child who is cared for by other children, perhaps neglect. Poor weight gain, lack of growth, lack of dental, medical, or mental care may be signs a child is experiencing neglect. The child who is begging for money, always asking for money, or maybe even stealing money or food could indicate the child is suffering from neglect. The child who does not have appropriate clothing for the weather, perhaps does not have winter clothing or summer type clothing, or does not have enough clothing. This could be, perhaps, a sign of neglect. The child is always watching, always watchful, always observing and looking and watching, could be saying the child is neglected. Now, what does neglect look like from the parent side? A parent who may neglect a child may seem apathetic or may seem depressed. The parent who is abusing drugs, abusing alcohol, may be neglecting their child. That parent who shows very little concern or does no care for the child, no care as in caring for the child, providing the child's needs, may be neglecting their child. When it comes to school, the parent who is always blaming the child for the problems in school, or simply ignores the problems the child's experiencing altogether, that parent may be neglecting their child. Now that we've seen what neglect is and what the signs might be, what are the results of neglect? Well, to begin with, the results and consequences might not be seen right away. The child who has experienced neglect, it may take time for that neglect, for those signs to appear. You see, neglect is also linked to later behavioral, physical, psychological challenges later in life. So if a child is being neglected on a Monday or a Tuesday or for a week or for a month or for the course of a year, that neglect may not appear evident until much later in the child's life. In addition, neglect may lead to high risk behaviors in the child. As you can imagine, a child who suffers from neglect will suffer cognitively. Neglect from lack of appropriate stimulation may lead to future and consistent learning delays and intellectual challenges. That child who is neglected, that child who is not stimulated in any way, may have learning disabilities. Academic problems and challenges or delays may also result in this. A child who's neglected may also experience some type of emotional development. As we've discussed here at the Foster Care Institute in several of our training webinars and several of our books, issues of attachment, issues of trust, issues of self-esteem may result from the child being neglected. Many times, a child who has been neglected is often left wondering who he can trust, who will be there for him? Is he worthy enough? Does he matter? Does anyone care about him? And is he worthy of being cared for? As we've seen, children who suffer from nutritional diets, neglected, the lack of food and nutrition may lead to health related issues. Indeed, malnutrition can impair the development of the child's brain. 50.3% of children who suffer from special health cares and healthcare needs 3 years after being removed from neglectful situation suffer the impairment of the development of their brain. This is according to the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Well-Being. Those children who have experienced neglect may face the challenge of developing. They may face this challenge of struggling to develop healthy relationships with others. They may face the challenge of forming healthy attachments with people. They may face the struggle of trusting somebody. Those who experience neglect struggle with developing any healthy relationship with their peers and with the adults in their lives. Those adults may be their parents, their caregivers, foster parents, caregivers, caseworkers, counselors, therapists, relatives, teachers. In addition to this, those who have faced neglect may also experience behavior disorders and even disinhibited social engagement disorder, otherwise known as DSED. We examine the DSED at the Foster Care Institute Training Webinar, Anxieties and Disorders, and we also disclose a great deal of information about it in the book, The Foster Care Survival Guide. Both of those are available here at the Foster Care Institute. Finally, roughly 75% of all child maltreatment-related deaths include neglect as a reason behind it. This statistic comes from us from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. As a foster parent, it's very likely you've had a child placed in your home who has experienced one of these forms or several of these forms of neglect. And note I said several forms of neglect. Make no mistake, a child can experience many forms of neglect. Perhaps they're being neglected in regards to attachments. Perhaps they're being neglected in charge of school and education, stimulation, food, all of these. So how do we help these children? These children who are placed in our home, these children who are placed in our care, these children who are placed in our caseloads, how do we help these children? Well, first off, we must be realistic. We must be realistic and reasonable with our expectations when it comes to trying to help children who have experienced neglect. Simply loving the child, having that child in your home and giving the child all the unconditional love that you can give that child, that is not going to fix the problem, so to speak. When a child experiences a form of neglect or forms of neglect, it may take a great deal of time. In regards to time, when the child is placed in your home, your foster care home, it's important for you to allow the child to comfortably adjust to his new home, to his new foster family, to his new foster siblings, to his new environment. It will take some time for the child to recognize that he's going to be okay. He's going to be safe. Perhaps he can even trust you. For that child who's been neglected by adults in his life, it is going to take some time for him in your home to adjust to a completely different environment. As we've seen here at the Foster Care Institute, it is very important for children. Indeed, it is necessary for children to form a healthy relationship with one main caregiver or one main adult figure in their life in order to develop socially, in order to develop emotionally. For that child who has not been able to develop socially and emotionally due to neglect, he will need to develop a relationship, a healthy relationship with you as his foster parent, or with his therapist or counselor, or with his caseworker, or with a teacher at his school. Most likely, he will try to form a relationship with you, his foster parent, because you are his main caregiver at this time. So look for ways to spend time with the child each day, each time. If you have several children in your home, more than one, it's very important. Indeed, it is essential that you look for ways to spend time with each child on an individual basis every single day. Is it difficult at times? Yes. But even as little as 10 to 15 minutes each day with each child, if that child has been neglected, can make a world of difference. Give that child the positive and emotional attention that they need and maybe never experience in their life. Do this on a day to day basis. So later on, they do not seek it out, that positive emotional attention they need, in a negative fashion. For those babies and toddlers who have been neglected, they need to be hugged. They need to be rocked. They need to be held. Now, be aware that some babies, some toddlers, some children who have been abused sexually, this type of physical nurturing can add to the child's trauma. So, beforehand, it is important that you find out the child's case. Why is the child in foster care? Why is the child placed in your home? What type of neglect did they experience? Before and during your initial nurturing the child, watch, observe how the child responds to you nurturing the child, and then respond to it. If the child responds to your nurturing in a negative fashion, then you need to react accordingly. You may need to change the way you nurture that child. For that child who may have been abandoned or that child has been neglected in a fashion where he's simply not been looked after, he needs to feel safe in your home. That safety can help that child's trauma. Thus, safety is a priority. Sometimes a child can be triggered by noises in your home, can be triggered by the nighttime or darkness, or ways that you simply cannot expect. Be prepared for that. Remind the child that he is safe. Remind the child that he's in a place where he is not going to be harmed. Remind the child that he's in a place where he is not going to be neglected. Indeed, he's going to be cared for. Maybe the worst thing you could do is to be critical of the child, or for your own children or other children in your home to make fun of, to poke fun, to mock the child. There should be no shaming. No shaming whatsoever. Do not be critical of this child in any fashion. Remind those living in your home to be like minded. Instead, show empathy for the child. He's going to feel bad enough about his experiences. So use phrases like this. If he should break something in your home, say this: it's okay, accidents happen, let's work on it together. If he should soil himself, if he should spill food, simply say, it's no worries, it's going to be okay, these things happen, we'll fix it together, let's work on this. So don't be critical and continue to reassure him that it's going to be okay. and continue to show that empathy towards that child. Interact with him at an emotional level. Those children who have been neglected, those children who have been abused, often are emotionally and socially delayed. Even though he may be 10 years of age physically, he may be interacting at a much different emotional or social level. So react to that accordingly. It is important to interact and meet the child at his emotional and social level. So you use words to him that are age appropriate to his emotional level. Those children who've been neglected are likely looking at you and listening to you on how to behave both at home and in public because they've never had a positive role model. They've never been able to watch somebody at an age like your age and how they interact in public and how they interact at home. They have not had somebody guide them or show them this. So you need to model appropriate behavior at home, appropriate behavior at the dinner table, appropriate behavior at bedtime, appropriate behavior in society, at school, at church, at the grocery store. They're looking to you on how to behave. They're listening to you on how to talk to others. They're always watching you. This is a heavy responsibility to be sure, but it's a responsibility as foster parents that we should embrace because we can show the child how to act in all environments. This child may have never had anybody show them how to act in an appropriate fashion. This is a gift that you have, the gift to show the child, to teach the child how to respond in certain situations, how to act in certain situations. Remember, they're always watching you, they're always listening to you. You are their role model. Other ways you can model appropriate behavior is to use play by play with the child and narrate scenarios and appropriate responses. For example, you're sitting down with the child at this dinner table and you're having a conversation with the child and you say, let's pretend something like this happened at school. How would you respond to it? Use play, if you will. How would you respond to somebody if they hit you at school? What would you do if somebody bumped into you at school and your books fell on the floor? What would you do if somebody at the grocery store gave you what you think is a dirty look? Use it play by play and then show them how to respond accordingly. Talk to them about appropriate physical behavior. Talk to them about how to give hugs or how to give eye contact, where to stand in accordance with others, how to groom themselves and use proper hygiene. The power of emphatic listening is one that is so very healing on so many different levels. We have a webinar here at the Foster Care Institute all about emphatic listening. There are many benefits of emphatic listening. I would encourage you to watch the webinar so you can find out how to be an emphatic listener. But these benefits include the fact that their emotional burdens are often lifted. When you listen to a child who has experienced abuse or neglect, when you listen to them in an emphatic way, many times their emotional burdens are lifted. Confusion and stress is relieved when they feel heard, when they feel that somebody's actually listening to them and that their emotions, their confusion, their stress is heard. Those who are listened to may gain more self-esteem and more self-awareness. Now, most of us like to talk rather than listen. For the child who's experienced abuse and neglect, One thing you can help this child to do is by listening to them. Take time to sometimes just sit down with them and listen. If they come to you and they want to talk, turn off the phone, put down the book, stop washing the dishes, stop folding the laundry, and take time to listen. Don't say, "Can you come back in a few minutes? I'm just working on this. I need to finish this up." You need to stop what you're doing and listen to them in an emphatic fashion. When we are doing emphatic listening, there's no sharing conversation, no give and take, there's no competition. We're simply listening. The focus is upon the child speaking and being listened to. Again, I would encourage you to watch the webinar here, the Foster Care Institute Emphatic Listening. Another way to help a child who has suffered neglect is by routine. Routine is very important in the life of your child from foster care, including his sleep. One way you can help him find a good night's sleep is providing a consistent sense of routine each evening before bedtime. This nightly routine may include bath, brushing teeth, getting clothes ready for school, packing a lunch, story time. Story time with your child each evening helps a child to relax. It establishes some quiet time before bedtime. It helps to form trust. It helps to form attachment. It helps a child develop cognitively. For much more about sleep disorders and routine, check out our webinar here at the Foster Care Institute on sleep disorders. For that child who has been neglected, don't be so quick to respond with a no or a negative response when they ask for something. Instead, look for a way to help the child with an acceptable alternative. Look for the opportunity to say yes. If they ask you something such as, "Can I stay up an hour later to watch TV?" You might respond this way. Instead of saying no so quickly, perhaps you want to say it this way. "Well, instead of staying up for an hour for TV, perhaps you could watch 30 minutes of TV and 30 minutes of reading." Or if they should say, "Can I have a piece of dessert?" Well, instead of having some dessert, because the child has experienced they've had neglect of healthy diet and trying to get them on a healthy diet, perhaps you could say something like this: "Well, let's talk about maybe you and I making some cookies together, and you can make some nutritional cookies." Look for an opportunity to say yes. "Can I wear this to school?" "Well, let's go up to your room and find something that we can pick out for you together to wear tomorrow to school." So don't always come up with the no or the negative response. Instead, look for an opportunity to say yes. Children who have been neglected need praise. They need to hear from you words of encouragement. Indeed, every child needs to hear words of encouragement and praise every single day and all throughout the day. Here's a great list that you can use to give praise to your child. "Thank you so much for helping with the dishwasher. I really appreciate it. You're the best dishwasher ever. I really appreciate it when you take out the garbage. Thank you so much. Hey, thanks for doing that. It means so much to me when you help out. Look at this. We did this together. Fantastic. Wow, you made a drawing. It looks so beautiful. Can I put it up on our refrigerator wall? Wow, look what you did. You did these spelling words in your spelling quiz. Fantastic. Let's tape it up. Can you tell me about when you had a prom at school? I'd love to hear more about it. Hey, what's your favorite part about this movie? Tell me about it. I really enjoyed cooking with you. Thanks so much for spending some time with me." They need to hear things like that from you. So look for ways to encourage them. Look for ways to praise them. For those children who have experienced neglect, most likely they are going to need some type of professional help. There should be no shame in you seeking out a professional therapist or a professional counselor. It is not a failure of you as a foster parent. Indeed, it is the opposite. It is you recognizing that there are those who can also help, and there are those who are professionally trained to do so. So, talk about this with your caseworker. Perhaps your caseworker has a professional therapist or counselor that they have been working with, and ask if you can have the child placed in your home, spend some time with a professional therapist or professional counselor. Indeed, you may wish to go a step further and go to family therapy sessions or family counseling sessions, you and the child. Now, for those children who have been neglected, those children have been abused, those children have been abandoned, remember to take care of yourself as well. Because if you can't care for yourself from time to time, if you do not take time for yourself, there is no possible way you can care for the child in your home. So take time for yourself so you do not become burned out, so you do not become stressed, so your batteries don't burn out, so the candle wick does not flame out because you are exhausted. As difficult as this may sound, take time for yourself. We have a whole webinar dedicated to this, the Foster Care Institute. We also address in the book the Foster Care Survival Guide. This is essential for all foster parents to take time for you. If you're unsure how to do it, please check out those webinars and the book. For much more on neglect and abuse and anxieties and disorders and so much more, check out Dr. John DeGarmo, fostercare.com. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Email me at drjohndegarmo@gmail.com. As one who's experienced so many children in my own home who have experienced neglect, how did I do it? How did I do it when I had 11 children at the same time in my home? Check out the book Love and Mayhem, One Big Family's Uplifting Story of Fostering and Adoption. It's my personal memoir as a foster parent. And we have several books here at the Foster Care Institute. You can get signed copies. I'm sure there's one book right now that's great for what you're going through. So many children in need, so many children in crisis, so many children who have experienced neglect. Thank you for dedicating your life. Thank you for making sacrifices. Thank you for all that you do to bring healing, to bring hope, to bring love to a child who has been neglected. For the Foster Care Institute, I'm Dr. John DeGarmo.